Turkish Airlines Flight 981. The cargo door failure that doomed 346 lives. A routine flight turns into disaster. On the morning of March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, prepared for its journey from Istanbul to London, with a scheduled stop in Paris Orly Airport. The aircraft was carrying 335 passengers and 11 crew members. Many passengers were British tourists returning home, while others included a large group of Japanese businessmen attending a trade fair in London. At 12:30 p.m., the aircraft took off from Orly Airport, under the command of Captain Nejat Berkaz, an experienced pilot with over 7,000 flight hours. Alongside First Officer Oral Ulusman and Flight Engineer Erhan Ozer. The climb was smooth and everything appeared normal, until the unthinkable happened. A catastrophic cargo door failure at 12:40 p.m., just 10 minutes after takeoff. As the aircraft climbed through 100 feet over the French countryside, a sudden and violent event occurred. The rear cargo door of the DC-10 explosively detached from the fuselage, causing rapid decompression inside the cabin. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The force of the decompression ripped out an entire section of the passenger cabin floor directly above the cargo hold. Tragically, this floor section housed critical flight control cables that ran from the cockpit to the aircraft's tail. The moment the floor collapsed, these cables were severed, leaving the pilots unable to control the plane. Passengers seated above the affected cargo area were violently ejected from the aircraft, their bodies pulled into the sky through the gaping hole in the fuselage. The remaining passengers screamed in terror as the aircraft, now completely out of control, entered a rapid and uncontrollable descent. The final moments, with no control over the aircraft, Flight 981 plunged towards the ground at nearly supersonic speed. The crew desperately tried to regain control, but with the severed cables, all flight surfaces, rudder, elevators and ailerons were completely unresponsive. At 12:41 p.m., just 77 seconds after the cargo door failure, Flight 981 crashed into the Ermenonville forest, about 37 kilometers, 23 miles, northeast of Paris. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated upon impact, creating a massive crater and scattering wreckage across the dense forest. The force of the crash was so immense that no bodies were left intact, making identification extremely difficult. All 346 people on board were killed instantly, making it the deadliest aviation disaster at the time and the worst crash involving a single aircraft until Japan Airlines Flight 123 in 1985. Investigation, a preventable tragedy. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators quickly focused on the cargo door as the cause. Shockingly, it was revealed that the DC-10 had a known defect in its cargo door locking mechanism. The design flaw stemmed from the fact that the door closed outward rather than inward, which meant it relied solely on mechanical latches to remain secure under cabin pressure. If the latches were not fully locked, the door could burst open mid-flight, leading to catastrophic decompression. Even more disturbingly, just 2 years earlier, a similar incident had occurred on American Airlines Flight 96, another DC-10 that experienced a cargo door blowout over Canada. However, in that case the floor only partially collapsed, and the pilots managed to land safely. Investigators found that McDonnell Douglas was already aware of the issue after the Flight 96 incident, but instead of implementing mandatory redesigns, they issued a simple maintenance bulletin recommending additional reinforcements, a measure that airlines were not required to follow. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 proved that the problem was far more dangerous than anticipated. The failure to take corrective action directly led to one of the worst aviation disasters in history. The aftermath in aviation reforms, the Ermenonville disaster sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. As a result, mandatory registration of tent doors were completely redesigned to prevent future blowouts. Stronger locking mechanisms, new fail-safe mechanisms, were introduced to prevent improper latching. Regulatory changes. Airlines were required to strictly follow safety recommendations, instead of treating them as optional. Crew training improvements. HM's enhanced pilot training was introduced to handle rapid decompression scenarios. Despite these improvements, the DC-10 continued to face safety concerns, and later incidents, such as United Airlines Flight 232's engine failure in 1989, further highlighted weaknesses in the aircraft's design. Ignored warnings led to disaster. The catastrophic failure of the DC-10's cargo door on Turkish Airlines Flight 981, was not an unforeseen event. It was the direct result of ignored safety warnings and negligence by McDonnell Douglas. The issue with the cargo door locking mechanism had already been exposed nearly 2 years earlier, on June 12, 1972, when American Airlines Flight 96, another DC-10, experienced a similar mid-air cargo door failure while flying over Windsor, Ontario, Canada. The warning: American Airlines Flight 96. On that flight, the rear cargo door detached in mid-air, causing a rapid decompression inside the cabin. The force of the event partially collapsed the passenger floor, which ran directly above the cargo hold. The pilots lost partial control of the aircraft, but unlike Flight 981, they were lucky. The cables controlling the tail section and flight surfaces were only partially damaged, allowing them to fight for control and execute a miraculous emergency landing in Detroit, Michigan. This serious safety event should have been a wake-up call for McDonnell Douglas and aviation regulator. Investigators quickly determined that the DC-10's outward opening cargo door was fundamentally flawed. Unlike inward opening doors, which become tightly sealed under cabin pressure, the DC-10's cargo door relied solely on mechanical latches to stay shut. If these latches failed or were not properly locked, the door could blow open mid-flight, causing explosive decompression. Exactly what had happened on Flight 96. McDonnell Douglas's failure to act despite the clear danger. McDonnell Douglas did not make the necessary structural changes to fix the defect. Instead of redesigning the locking mechanism, they issued a service bulletin, a non-mandatory recommendation advising airlines to reinforce the cargo doors. Airlines, including Turkish Airlines, were not required to implement the fix, leaving hundreds of flights vulnerable to the exact same failure that had nearly downed Flight 96. The manufacturer also failed to inform flight crews about the cargo door hazard, meaning pilots were unaware of the potential for catastrophic failure, and had no procedures in place to handle such an emergency. A preventable disaster. Flight 981 repeats history. Less than 2 years later, on March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 suffered the same cargo door failure at 100 feet, but this time, there was no chance of survival. Unlike Flight 96, where the control cables were only partially damaged, Flight 981's entire floor section collapsed, completely severing the control cables. This left the pilots with no control over the aircraft, sending it into an uncontrollable nosedive that ended in one of the worst crashes in aviation history. The aftermath. Lessons learned too late. The crash of Flight 981 shocked the aviation industry and led to immediate changes. Authorities forced McDonnell Douglas to finally redesign the DC-10's cargo doors, ensuring they could never fail in the same way again. Mandatory safety modifications were introduced, including stronger locking mechanisms, warning systems, and crew training. However, these changes came too late for the 346 people aboard Flight 981B1. Their lives were lost not because of an unknown defect, but because a known deadly flaw was ignored until it caused a catastrophe. The tragedy of Flight 981 stands as a grim reminder of what happens when profit and negligence take precedence over human lives.